My name is Ross Christie and I work for the museums team, and I'll be hosting this event and moderating the conversation. Tonight's discussion connects closely with the exhibition currently on display in the Wardlaw Museum, which is called From These Parts, Scotland's Art and Identity. That exhibition is a collection of art from the University's Boswell collection of Scottish art, which celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, alongside work from the Royal Scottish Academy, which will be celebrating its 200th anniversary in 2026. The Chronicles fits naturally with the programme for this exhibition, as it invites us to consider how stories of Scotland have been written, preserved and interpreted through time. Just quickly, a short word on this evening's format. Shortly I'll introduce our panellists, and we'll go through a series of themes and questions around the Chronicles, and that should last around 50 minutes. Following this conversation, there'll be time for questions and answers from both the in-person audience and from those joining us online. As I mentioned, the online audience this evening, this event is being recorded and live transmitted. We'd like to welcome one of our online guests in particular, Dr. Bill Zatz, and we'd like to thank him and the Friends of the Nation's Libraries for their support in the acquisition of the St Andrews Chronicles. The online audience also are welcome to ask questions. Please use the chat or the Q&A function at any time to ask questions, and we'll ask them at the end. And for our in-person audience, please leave your questions until the last 30 minutes, and we'll have a chance for you to share them then. For the online audience as well, we'll be sharing some slides throughout the event. You should see them there, and we should see them here. There's one point where we'll have to turn the lights off because it's not the best room to be able to see this presentation. So we'll turn the lights off for a few minutes as we have a look at some of these slides. We're also photographing the event this evening and the drinks later on at the Wardlaw. If you prefer not to be photographed or to have your photograph shared online, please let myself know and we'll make sure we don't do that. As I mentioned, following the discussion, at around about 7 o'clock, there will be a drinks reception down at the Wardlaw Museum where you're all welcome to attend. The Chronicles is on display in Gallery 1, and you're welcome to visit the From These Parts exhibition as well. So I'll now introduce the panellists. Firstly, we're honoured to be joined by Professor Dame Sally Mapstone, Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of St Andrews. Dame Sally is a medievalist specialising in medieval and Renaissance Scottish literature with 8 books and numerous articles on Older Scots and Middle English. Her academic expertise, combined with her leadership at the university, offers a uniquely informed perspective on the significance of this manuscript, both intellectually and institutionally. We're also delighted to welcome Professor Dauvit Broun, Professor of Scottish History at the University of Glasgow, where he has taught since 1990, all right?
Absolutely.
He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2013 and a Fellow of the British Academy in 2017. A leading authority on medieval Scottish texts and charters, he has served as Principal Investigator on major AHRC-funded projects, and his recent work includes an article examining the oldest section of the St Andrews Chronicles. And finally, we'd like to welcome Elizabeth Henderson, Rare Books Librarian here at the University of St Andrews. Elizabeth read history and English at Oxford before undertaking her librarianship qualification at University College London, and she's led the care and interpretation of our rare books collection for 20 years. Our research focuses on book production, circulation and ownership in the late medieval and early modern Scotland, giving her a unique understanding of the physical and historical life of this manuscript. So I guess we should kick off with our first theme, which is the Chronicles journey. I'm going to start with a very simple question. What are the St Andrews Chronicles? And I'll start with Dauvit.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed. And it's lovely to be here and celebrate this magnificent manuscript. And just to preface this by saying how deeply I appreciate the fact that it has found a wonderful home in the University of St Andrews, where we can all study it and enjoy it, because the terrible risk about anything going up for sale is that it can go into private hands. Some private owners, of course, are extremely good, but others just week it away and you never get sight of it again. I can share some sad stories about that over a glass of wine or something afterwards, because it's so painful. So this one, I mean, we'll talk later about the significance of it, of course, in more detail, but just to say, I mean, there are, most of it is a copy of John Mayer's history of Great Britain, and so we'll hear more about that in a minute. The bit that interests me is the older bit, which, oh, you can't really see, but it's the first 38 folios, and if you were to look at it, it still sticks out a little bit at the top, and when it was being looked at in the National Library in 1990. They did a study of the paper there, and the watermark suggested this was about a generation earlier than the rest of it. So the watermarks were 1511. Yeah. And so that doesn't mean to say it was written on then, but it gives you a terminus post quem. And this book, 38 folios, is crammed full of goodies for the likes of me, who is interested in the way people interact with the kingdom's past. But if you're interested in sort of narrative history and good stories, it's a bit of a disappointment, because basically it's got an account of Britain drawn from Henry of Huntingdon, book 1 to begin with, and then it goes through Scottish origin legend, and followed by king lists, followed by an account of Malcolm III and Margaret and their descendants. And then we've got a bit of English history where we're given, Edward Ironside through to Margaret, and we've got, all of this is basically material which, not in the same form, but text which we've known about elsewhere. Could say more about that later if need be. But then there is something which is unique, which is it's a brief chronicle, annalistic chronicle, which covers from 1285 and 1286. Uncertainty there is just how it articulates with the account of Malcolm III and Margaret's descendants, from there to 1327. We might say more about that later. And then, that's just the first item in the 38 folios. And then you've got more similar material. You've got accounts of kings of Britain stroke England up to Edward the Martyr, and another sort of summary chronicle, you might call it, which covers from Malcolm and Margaret through to 1390, and it's found in other places. Steve Borden's identified an example in the Bodleian, Fairfax manuscript date, for example, and then we've got another fairly unique text, but it's derivative of, closely related to Bowers, sort of book 5 of Bowers' Chronicon, and that is it's sort of reorganized it as 21 notes, and that's something that needs a bit more thought. What are they doing there to create that? So yeah, quite a lot of detail there. Sorry, that's a bit of an information dump, but you can get a sense of the sort of things it is, which is, as I say, it's like a reference work, if you like. It's giving you lists of kings, sort of little bits of story with the origin legend, but it gives you a complete conspectus of Scottish history with a strong British element.
Thank you, Dauvit. And Sally?
So so that's a brilliant account of the first part of it, of the manuscript. And let me also just say how excited we are to have this manuscript in St Andrews, and I would like to acknowledge the incredibly important part that Bill Sachs, who is watching tonight, played in helping us acquire this manuscript. You can barely get through doing anything in Scotland without talking about golf. So I do want to say that Bill and I first started talking about this manuscript when we were actually at the Masters in Augusta last April, and Bill started talking about the auction of some of Martin Shoyan's manuscripts. And I immediately pricked my ears up because, of course, I knew about this manuscript, and actually I'd had the privilege of seeing it quite briefly in 1990 when it was in the National. It had resurfaced. It's a very interesting manuscript because it keeps going missing. So there's a big gap between the late 16th century and 1990 when it surfaced in Bangor in Northern Ireland when it was being kind of auctioned then, which is when Shoyan bought it. There was a period when it came to the National Library of Scotland, and Rod Lyle was working on the paper and gave me an opportunity to have a look at it. So I knew it. I knew what an important manuscript it was. And when Bill mentioned that it was being sold, I was just hugely excited, because I think when it went off to Norway in 1990, we all thought we weren't going to see it again, unless, like Dauvit, we made the pilgrimage out there to actually go and take a look at it, which he should talk about later if you can persuade him. So the manuscript's totally in Latin. We have called it the St Andrews Chronicles, which reflects the fact that it is dominantly chronicle material, but very different chronicle material. And the fascinating thing about it is that or one of the many fascinating things about it, is that it juxtaposes this material that, as Dauvit says, Latin material that comes from the, if you like, the chronicle king list traditions in both England and Scotland. And then after 38 folios, a different scribe takes over, and in large part gives you a transcription from a printed book. And this was a printed book, printed in Paris in 1521, the Historia Majoris Britanniae, which is generally translated as the History of Greater Britain, but you could also translate it as Mayor's History. It was by John Mayor, born in Haddington in about 1467, lived to the ripe old age of about 83, which was very unusual in the 16th century, educated variously and quite unusually in some respects, first at Cambridge and then in Paris, and then had a series of back and forth posts between Glasgow and Paris. This is now in the early 16th century, and then a significant period at this university attached to St Salvator's College. And Mayor was a prolific writer. He wrote a huge number of theological, logical, philosophical tracts. But then in the 1520s, he wrote his own history of Scotland. And what was very striking about this history, and this I think is one of the many fascinating things about it, is that it was doing something quite unusual, which was advocating for the dynastic or marital union of England and Scotland. And this was a sort of unusual and in some respects quite controversial position to take. So this, the larger part of the manuscript is a manuscript copy from Mayor's printed book. Now, this in itself is not unusual in 16th century Scotland, although printing came to Scotland in 1508. It came initially very sporadically, and it was very customary for Scots to get their books printed elsewhere. So Mayor's history was printed in Paris by the famous Flemish printer José Bardias Ascensius, who printed quite a lot of works by Scottish authors. But what is very striking is that this work is copied here in manuscript form. And although it was not uncommon, indeed it was relatively common for printed books to be copied as manuscript, it was actually quite unusual for Mayor's Chronicle. In fact, I think Roger doesn't think there's another printed
we don't know
copy of it. So, I mean, this audience is so learned that somebody here may know of one, but it's actually very unusual to find a manuscript copy of Mayor. And to my mind, and I mean, Dauvit's done some brilliant work on this, and I think he's very right about it, but I think let's sort of take it a bit further. To my mind, what's very striking about this is that I think whoever put the two works together, or sets of works together, was seeing a continuity in thought between Mayor's arguments for union and some of the material that is found in the earlier chronicles. So you're getting a sort of throughput, if you like. And what is really interesting about this is that it's not a total copy of Mayor. Firstly, it omits, rather sadly in my view, because I like book one of the history, it omits the whole of book one, which talks about all sorts of things about the eating habits of the Scots and the English and all of this kind of thing. It doesn't give you all that. And it also omits a lot of the origin myth material. And I think that's deliberate. It starts in about chapter 4 of book 2. But then very strikingly, it's not a straightforward copy. There's a later 17th century or 18th century reader of the manuscript who very helpfully has gone through and done something that I've also done just to check it, which is that he annotates the manuscript in terms of which chapters from which books are included. And what is actually very striking is that this is a selective copying of Mayer's Chronicle. It's not a straightforward copy. It's a deliberate, in my view, you may differ, a deliberate selection of material. And we can say a bit more about this later. And to my mind, that makes it extremely interesting. I mean, I should say, I work on this very occasionally when I'm not trying to run the university. And so I've got a lot more basic research to do on this. But what my preliminary work has suggested to me is that there is an attempt, in my view, to, as it were, align the choice of the material from Mayer's Chronicle that is included with the earlier material, which makes it actually a fascinating compilation.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Sally. You've answered some of my next question already, which was about the origins of the manuscript, but maybe you could go into a bit more detail about where it's been in the past and how it came to be here with us at St Andrews.
So,
Do you want me to take that?
Get involved.
So we don't know exactly when the manuscript was produced. The research on the paper that Wardlaw did in 1990 suggests it's written sometime after the earlier section that Dauvit was talking about was written sometime after 1510, 1511. Excuse me. And the Mayer section is written on paper, which probably dates from 1526. So, you know, a little bit later on. It does seem to be from that first 30 years of the 16th century that the entire manuscript is produced and still has contemporary binding on it, which is something that I hope we'll come back to and talk about, because that's one of the things that excites me the most about this. There's no scribal colophon, there's nothing that tells us that who wrote it and when he finished it and how many hours it took, which occasionally you helpfully get in manuscripts. There's nothing like that here. We do have two different hands, and you can see hopefully on that slide above me the abrupt change of hand and the continuity when the Mayer text begins. There's no gap, there's no space left there, but there is a change of text and there is a change of hand. What we do know is a series of names that have been written into the manuscript who've owned it. There's a Robert Roberton, who's described as a chaplain of Edinburgh, who may well be the first person to put his name on it. There are three members of the Kemp family, Henry, George and David, who write their names on it, suggesting perhaps different members of the same family. There's one inscription which mentions a Walter Buchanan, and then it comes into the hands of John Lindsay, Lord Menmuir, and therefore part of what's now the Balcarres Library, a famous, now noted book collector and scholar. And he dies at the end of the 16th century, and we don't know after that. As you said, there is a gap. It probably stayed in Balcarres for longer than that, because his successor, David, is a book collector himself. He actually buys a printed copy of Mayer in 1620. I don't think he's the kind of person who would have got rid of it, but we don't know at what point it leaves the Balcarres Library. Then it turns up in 1990 in Northern Ireland. And the slide that I did have on the screen was the description that Sotheby's gave of it when they auctioned it in 1990, where it was described as a Scotichronicon, which of all the things it may or may not be, it clearly is not that. But there is no title page, you know, there is no kind of signpost as to what it contains. And really it's only Dauvit and yourself looking at it much more closely have been able to establish the significance of the manuscript. I think perhaps even in 1990, the significance wasn't recognised.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, it's really Dauvit's work on the early part that's been the most significant. And I do think, I mean, all sorts of people here could do it, but I do think the Mayer material really needs proper looking at, but it needs to be looked at in connection with the earlier material as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Another question for you, Elizabeth. What was it like seeing the manuscript for the first time and studying it when it arrived with us at St Andrews?
I mean, we could all talk about the first time we saw it in different times and different places. Obviously, it was tremendously exciting. The auction had been tense and stressful because the bidding was competitive and we didn't know which way it was going to end
But
up.
we always thought the
But,
bill would get it.
We
Yes,
did,
yes.
we did. We trusted that. And we were very lucky actually to have Sandra Hindman,
Yeah.
manuscript expert in the room as our agent, very experienced at auctions and knew, you know, how to handle the pressure of that situation expertly. But knowing it was coming, waiting to actually see it, unlike Dauvit and Professor Mapstone, I'd never seen this in real life before. I'd seen photographs of it. I knew about its significance. I knew about its importance. There was a group of us sitting in the library annex, and every time the doorbell rang, we jumped up, and it never was the manuscript. So there was about 6 false starts before the parcel actually arrived. And we were able to unwrap it, and just everybody who was working there that day just gravitated to it and came and you know, couldn't not look at as we unwrapped this and just started seeing. I mean, the binding, I could have looked at the binding for a very long time, but even when you opened it and started going through the text, there was so many exciting things to think about and to see. And I'm sure it was similar when you first saw it.
I do think Dauvit should talk about
Absolutely.
the pilgrimages
Oh,
to go and see it.
Well, I mean, so the first time I saw it was actually online. So this was, so Martin Shoyan had an online catalogue. That's probably still there, actually. And so I was just browsing at my desk, as one does. And this may have been 15 or 20 years ago, I can't remember what. And saw this thing called, you know, what do they call it? Lindsayana's
Yes,
Chronicles.
yes.
And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And there was one page that had been digitized, you know, that was online, and it was an account. It included at least an account of the raid into England in 1322, and it was in a form which I didn't recognize. So I thought, well, I better check this out. You know, the way it was described, and it was like nothing else. So, so I got in touch with. In those days, he had a librarian, and they very kindly digitized the first 24 folios, well, scanned them and sent them off. So that was fine. So I played around with them for a wee bit. But obviously, you need to see the real thing. And going to Norway is a wonderful experience, but takes a wee bit of time anyway. And what you had to do, you see, was to get to Oslo and then get a train 40 minutes out to a place called Spikkestad. And then he himself lived at the edge of a forest, about 20 minutes walk away from the station. And there he had a building which might have been a converted barn that was for his manuscripts. And there was a room there for people to use. And he basically left you to get on with it. And so I saw it twice. So that was August 2019. And then I was lucky enough to be in Oslo in June 2022 on another project. And yeah, the first time was during a holiday, so that was only a couple of hours. And then we spent a bit more time, second time round. And of course, I mean, as many, if not all of you will know, especially these days, we understand that just reading the text is only taking you, dipping your toe into the water, and you really want to understand the whole thing. And in this case, the physical makeup was extremely interesting because there it was clearly originally the separate booklet, the bit I was interested in. And its makeup was unusual. And because Martin Shoyan left me to my own devices, I was able to prod it and do all sorts of things to it that you would never be allowed to do in the Napier reading room anywhere else.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on, maybe a question that each of you could answer from your own perspectives, but what new discoveries have the Chronicles brought to light as you've investigated them?
It's more Dauvit.
Well, so a number of different. Please sound a bell. Point to tell me to shut up. But so at one level, I mean, the immediate level was here is a source for the period of the War's independence, hitherto unknown. Once I saw so that was just one little bit of it. That's sort of folios, what was it, 17 to 24. So really a tiny bit. And to be honest, and I'll explain in a minute more, but to be honest, my main interest was in the rest of it. But But it was, of course, wonderful to see something that's related to the War of Independence, hitherto unknown. It had clearly been seen by Bauer when he was doing the Scottish Chronicle, reading the Scottish Chronicle. There's bits now that you can see that's where he got it from. And so going through that, there isn't a lot of information that is new if you're interested in that sort of thing. But there were a couple of little tidbits, and one was, there you are, there were 7 guardians, not 6, that were elected at the end of April 1286. And the reason that we've never heard about the 7th one is because by the time we've got the first document that survives from the guardians in September 1286, Bishop William of Dunkeld, who's this other one, had died. So, of course, he disappeared from memory. So that was one, that was potentially... well, I'm sure it's interesting. I'll stop there. I mean, it sort of makes sense in a way that they went for even number, an odd number, because if they ever had a vote, then you would at least get the results. Thinking back to Simon de Montfort and his Council of 15, but also there was just this little bit of information about William Wallace and his killing of the Sheriff of Lanark. And on the one side there was, I mean, Geoffrey Barrow had written that this happened in May, and now it's clear it happened on the 3rd of May. And you may think that's not a big deal, but what is that it was William Wallace and Richard de London.
Yeah.
So you had this created the pattern that can now be recognised that William Wallace was, doing the big actions with somebody else who was a social superior. So that pattern emerged. So these are little tidbits. But for me, the sort of biggest discovery is just to see this incredibly rare survival, this booklet, because it would, I mean, I like to think of it as being a sort of private possession, whether it was written for somebody, because it's, I mean, the writing may not seem much to you, but it looks pretty proficient, and it's got rubrics and so on, or whether this was actually written by the scribe for their own use. But it's a form which is really ephemeral. I mean, it's not bound, it's not made for a library, so it's not the sort of thing that tends to be kept. But, in light of seeing one of these little sort of compendia of the whole reach of Scottish history, mainly in the forms it lists, etc., and Scottish history that includes British history, seeing that in this form made it possible to recognise, for me to recognise anyway, that this is actually probably the way that the kingdom's history was understood and digested and engaged with much more regularly than we would otherwise imagine, because of course we turn to the library shelves and pick out Scottish Chronicle and go to National Library of Scotland, and you've got an array of different versions of Scottish Chronicle and antecedents and successive versions of it, and all the rest of it. All these things are that's what we naturally think of as what was Scottish history understood to be in its completeness in the later Middle Ages. But now we've got this, and just to give you couple of potential ways to think about this. One is that now basically every time I see a compendium like this, and those of you familiar with the 12th century will be, indeed earlier, will be familiar with a thing called the Poppleton compilation. It's in form, it's very similar. It survives because it's been incorporated textually, not physically, textually into manuscript produced in York in around 1350, 1360. But that looks like it was one of these. It was a wee booklet that somebody had for themselves, and it circulated. This material circulated in that form. Also, this helps to make sense of something that's been a bit of a puzzle, at least for me, is the wonderful Andrew Winton, who produced his astonishing
enormous
version of the history of Scotland and the world in Scots in verse, and he was working at the early part of the 15th century. Shows no knowledge of John of Fordun's history or its antecedents. no knowledge at all. And this, I mean, be absolutely clear about this because he got himself into a real fankle by the time he was revising it for the last time, his work for the last time, real fankle about Fergus, the first king, who for him was pre-Pictish. So he had 13 plus kings, 20-something kings, 13 of whom he named, preceding the Picts, and yet he looked up his genealogy and realised there was only 10 generations between Fergus, the first king, and Kenneth MacAlpin, and he realised this doesn't work. And he just couldn't do. He just didn't know. He basically says, if somebody else can figure this out, it looks to me as if there's something wrong here. If he had any access to John of Forden, or what I call Proto Forden, or anything previous, that problem would have been solved. Even if he had had a look at this, actually, that problem would have been solved. So where was he getting his material from? And the answer, I think, is it was something like this.
Yeah.
It was just another of these little booklet things that were going around with king list, genealogy, origin legends. And you can trace, in fact, PhD was tracing what I now realise is one of these booklets floating about. There was a compendium of origin legend, genealogy, and king list. And so in sum, I can hear the bell tinkling. In sum, for me, this has helped to give flesh to something that was pretty vague and inchoate before. I mean, this is a pretty extensive and smart version of one of these booklets that I'm imagining was the main way that Scottish history in its entirety, if you like, was consumed. The only comparable thing, but it's different, is James Gray's Commonplace book, which has one book, but one gathering, which would have been independent, I'm sure, originally. Talk about that more, maybe over a glass or something. But it's a commonplace book, so it's not the same.
And it's tiny.
And it's tiny. It's
Tiny.
exactly, and it really is. But he's doing he's used the same thing, the same
Yes.
kind of thing. Indeed related to the one that Winton must have used. Anyway, I better stop.
Just to, if you don't mind, I mean, what's also really interesting is that in this period you've got a lot of material that's actually in Scots starting to appear, compilations of this thought. But this obviously isn't. The whole thing's Latin all the way through, which makes you think a little bit about who it was for, who was reading it, what was the purpose. But also a lot of the compilations that are produced around the same time, including a certain number that are in the vernacular, are taking a very, I mean, I'm using my words rather imperfectly here, but they're taking a pretty sort of pro-independence, nationalistic line. And you have argued that the sort of consonance of this material is actually rather interesting because it's less about origin myth stuff, more about, as it were, the king list course of Scottish history, the relation of the nations, if you want to call them that, of England and Scotland. So there's something else going on there that's rather interesting, isn't there? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so this. Now, I've got to be slightly careful here because, of course, when I'm mentioning these other booklets that William, that Winton used and so on and so forth, of course, they don't survive, and they'll have just picked out the bits that interested them. But this is wonderful because it shows you, if you like, it's an exemplar of how unexpected and complicated these things can be, because it does have this very deliberate strain of British history in it, right from the beginning, setting the scene with large quotations from Henry of Huntington's Historia Anglorum, book 1, and then later on, and it's basically about Margaret's ancestors. So that's a very prominent feature of this. But what is even something to constantly bear in mind is that the first item, what I've called the first item, so that's through to folio 24, is itself a copy of an earlier compilation, which also therefore had this British emphasis. So this wasn't just a sort of early 16th century way of seeing Scottish history. It has a longer pedigree. I could say more about that. But,
Thank you very much. I think you've answered a few of the additional questions already, which is fantastic. Dame Sally, perhaps you could go into a bit more detail about what extent this manuscript may have been created with a specific purpose in mind, whether that be politically or culturally or otherwise.
Well, obviously, I'm going to sort of start flying very speculative kites here, but why not? It's interesting to just let that run a bit and possibly spark other people to work on this. So I mean, I think we have to think. Dauvit quite rightly says you've got this compilation, which itself is copying parts of earlier compilations. So the manuscript, as it now stands, we have to see it as a sort of palimpsest, if you like. But there is clearly a sort of thematic tenor to the way in which the first 38 folios work together, which shows this interest in the relation of things Scottish and English. I mean, so you can just put that there and then think, well, what happens in about 1526 or thereabouts? Maybe Robertoun thinks, well, okay, I want to, as it were, sort of think this through and expand beyond where we've got to in this manuscript, putting together Scottish and English things. And Mare's Chronicle is actually a rather interesting vehicle for doing that, because it's going to take us up to the latter part of the 15th century. And I mean, this is obviously where one does necessarily get very speculative. But from my perspective, if you look at the choices that are being made, there's both in the material that's selected from Mare, there's both what appears to be a deliberate intention to actually omit some material that's already been covered. So the Malcolm and Margaret stuff is not there. It's actually those chapters in book 3, I think, are taken out, because actually you could argue it's already been covered in the earlier part, which to me is rather interesting. And material is sort of reordered so that you are looking at the juxtaposition of English and Scottish history in a way that kind of makes you think of them together. Also, quite a lot of the early stuff about the Picts and the Scots is not repeated. And again, that was there in the earlier compilation. And now, I mean, you'd need to do a lot more work on that. And Dauvit has, I mean, I'm in a sense, my argument's actually quite similar to what Dauvit has already published on this. But it seems to me that you can argue that the manuscript reflects this real interest in thinking about Scottish and English history together in a way that is actually quite distinctive when you look at, as I was suggesting, some of the other materials that are being produced around this time. Hector Boyce's history, a lot of the smaller chronicle compilations that are sort of fiercely nationalistic. This is tussling much more with the notion of what, if you like, union means. Union both, as Mare would argue it, but also union just when you think about Britain as one nation working across between the English and the Scots. And that's actually a very interesting take, because it ties the manuscript in, to my mind, to precisely the sorts of things that we all still agitate about now. How do we think about Scottish independence? How do we think about unionism? We often tend to sort of interrogate these things as if they're very much of this moment. But in fact, looking back, you can see that actually these are real subjects that are real for people in the 15th and 16th century, even if they don't quite position themselves politically in the ways that we recognize. And to me, what's very interesting about this is that I was always very struck during the 2014 referendum, how little attention there was to the history of Scotland when it was, so to speak, an independent nation. It seemed to me that a sort of, if you like, an obvious pro-independence argument was to say, well, we have this prehistory when we were a nation in our own right, and these are some of the features of it. And it was remarkable, particularly as it was also the anniversary of Bannockburn, how little that actually got into the political discourse. And one of the many things that's fascinating about this manuscript is that it sort of takes you back to ways in which those kind of issues were being interrogated then, probably in and around St Andrews.
Thank you. So, Elizabeth, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, just something came to mind with the 2014 referendum. I remember I was asked, this was a sort of public talk organised by the Archdiocese of Edinburgh, and my topic was, it wasn't meant to be about the referendum, but it was just, I thought it'd be interesting to do a talk called The Origins of Scottish Independence,
Yes.
and which anybody knows my work will realise it's not beating any drums at all. It's usually festooned with footnotes and other joys, but the organisers had a bit of a thing, and they thought, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? This is about independence all of a sudden." So it was almost like it was taboo to talk about. I mean, it went ahead, but I was told there was a flurry of anxiety amongst the organisers.
There you go.
Thank you. I just wondered, maybe coming back to Elizabeth, and maybe this is slightly off topic, but you've mentioned some of the other existing books around at the same era. If you could maybe go into a bit more detail about how this compares with some of those other manuscripts and books from the same period. Is there anything that makes it particularly unique other than what we've discussed?
That's a really interesting question. I do very much want to hear what the rest of the panel has to say. If I maybe start us off by sketching out a few things, and then we can take it from there and see where we go. We can think about similarity in different ways. So we could think about genre. So it's a historical work. It's manuscript, not print, and both of those in 1510 and 1526 are absolutely circulating. And we can look at similarities of physical features in terms of, is it written on paper or on parchment? Is it, look at the binding and so on. So I was thinking about this in terms of the genre, the historical genre, that spans an enormous range in terms of manuscripts. And at one end, we have something like the presentation manuscript of Bellenden written for James V, which is the most elite, luxurious manuscript covered in illumination gold. It's nothing like this. And it's also physically larger as well. And then at the other end, we do have these kind of smaller scale, more workaday manuscripts, less decorated. The ones that I was kind of circling around when I was thinking about this, can you maybe go towards the end? There's a couple of comparative manuscripts that I just want to kind of park for suggestions and see where that takes us. There are lots and lots of copies of the Scottish Chronicles and its variants and its abridgments. And one that I pulled out just for comparison, we're going to have to keep going through a lot of slides, but you will get to a picture of it. There's a manuscript in Edinburgh, EUL MS 186, which is, it's a composite manuscript, but it does contain part of the Scottish Chronicles. I've chosen that as a kind of point of comparison, but to really highlight some of the differences. It's written on parchment. Ours is written on paper, so it's a more expensive manuscript. You can see just from the initial there that it's more decorated. Ours just has rubrication. It's written in 2 columns. Ours is just in 1 column and so on. And it's nearly twice the height. Our manuscript is actually quite small. You'll see when you go to the Wardlaw, it's about 20 centimetres in height, and this one is 40 centimetres. So much, much bigger. Dauvit, I know you've been thinking around in terms of physical size about, the best comparisons. The other manuscript, which I can this one incidentally is 1510, so that's why I pulled that one out as being very similar in date. This other one, which some people in this room will recognise very well, is a little bit later. It's 1548, but this is the St Andrews Marchment manuscript of the Regiam. And I pulled this out just because to me there is a similarity, not of hand, but just of nature of manuscript it's written on paper, it's not decorative. This one doesn't, I don't think, have any rubrication. But there is a similarity in terms of it's a kind of slightly workaday copy. Yes. So those were just some of the thoughts I was having around where we might situate this manuscript in terms of comparison. I'd love to hear what the rest of the panel thinks of.
So I've spent most of my life working on Scottish manuscripts, and most of them are fairly horrible, actually. They're not, they're not objects of beauty. And this to me was, I didn't think, on the spectrum of horrible manuscripts, it's sort of somewhere in the middle, I would have said. It's also quite nice. Nobody's been sick in it or anything like that, which you certainly do find in some manuscripts, and it's quite reasonably nicely put together. But it's workaday is actually quite it's there for a purpose, and I think it's worth sort of thinking a bit about the 1520s in Scotland, because in terms of book history, it's a funny period, because you've got printing arrives with a little bit of drama in 1508, and then a few years later you have the disaster of Flodden, and culturally after that for a good 10 or 15 years you're not seeing a huge amount of literary production, manuscript production that really survives extensively. There are things, but there's virtually no printing surviving in Scotland really until into the 1520s and towards the end. So it's a curious period for manuscript production and for printing. And as I indicated earlier, most of the really significant printing is taking place overseas of Scottish works, mostly Bardius Ascensius hasn't got the monopoly, but he knows a lot of people. So it's extremely interesting to see this manuscript being produced in the 1520s, because to my mind it shows things sort of cranking into action again. It also tells you something about the way in which Mayor was being received, which I think we've also slightly lost sight of, because one of the things that happens, Mayor's history comes out, it's very anti-origin myth. It's anti a lot of things, very rude about Caxton, he's very rude about Highlanders, but it's very readable. But then within a few years, it's sort of eclipsed by Hector Boyce's history. Printed 1526, again, Bardius Ascensius, and a bigger book, widely circulated, translated very quickly into Scots, which is going back to origin myth stuff and inventing a huge amount of material. And I think Mayor has suffered almost since that period from being sort of somewhat quashed or eclipsed by a different narrative. And this gives us a very interesting insight into how in that period, in the 1520s, Mayor was being seen and used, which I think is something we really need to reflect on within the cultural moment of that time, which was also politically, of course, a very challenging time in Scotland from the monarchical and governance point of view. So I think that's another reason why this is such an interesting manuscript.
Oh, indeed. So yes, and the thing I'm just I mean, I was talking about how I imagine this as the booklet, at least as a personal manuscript, and now, thanks to your work, looking at it more closely, the Mayor more closely, you see this is just the same thing. It's a personal response to, now, of course, all manuscripts are personal at some level, individual by definition, and there's lots of different ways of thinking about this. And even in the most, amazing display copy type of thing of Scottish Chronicle, thinking of one of Magnus MacCulloch's, I think is the Harleian one. And he's got his name all over it in various, very sort of smart, and referring to his patron, Archbishop Shevis. So that's personal, but in a very different way. But I'm really the comparators, if you like, for this is the more sort of workaday, shall we say, personal versions of doing the kingdom's history. And the ones that come to mind are the John Law, who did his sort of boiled down version of Scottish Chronicles. So I don't know if that's been looked at in great detail, but it'd be fascinating to do.
No, Durkin did the best.
But he did.
Yeah, but he didn't do a huge amount.
No, this is right. It's just actually to do what you've been doing with this, and just to see what was missed out, what was.
It's not been digitized.
No, it's not. And it's a smaller one than this. Or you've got John Gibson's version of, and it's not Scottish Chronicle. I think it's a later version of Scottish Chronicle that or is the Book of Keeper Angus version, 40-book version, and he's boiled that down for his own use. And it's a little bit bigger inside. The page size is a bit bigger than this, and of course it's a proper volume. And it's in the National Library. So it's things like that, and that's 1501. John Law's 1520s. I can't remember. So it's all about the same time. So there's a wee project that somebody could really
what was happening in the 1520s would be a great one.
And it's just because these are personal responses, they're going to, we've got to imagine there are many others that are potential that don't survive. So it's not to get too hung up on these particular examples as representing everything, of course not, but it's just, they give us a window into this phenomenon of the personal response to the kingdom's history.
Fantastic, thank you. We're getting towards time for our conversation, so I may skip to the last question, which is, I guess, directed to all of you, and hopefully you can all answer in turn. But why does this manuscript matter to Scotland today, from each of your individual perspectives? Would anyone like to start, or should I just pick someone?
I think I've already said what I think it matters. I mean, I think it matters because it reminds us that many of the issues that we care about now when we think of Scotland's political history are there with different inflections, but connected inflections in the 15th and 16th century. And that it reminds us that, as Roger Mason so often says, you know, the past should be usable, you know, and I think you absolutely see it in this particular compilation, and there's a lot to be learned from that.
I think just adding to that, looking at this manuscript, there's so much that we still could learn from it with more work and more study. And the fact that the names of the people who've owned it are not part of the kind of the established canon of people that we know of as book owners. They're not names that turn up in Durkin and Ross or some of the other standard you know, works. That it gives us a whole new cast of characters who are owning books and reading and writing history, or interested in history. Apart from Lord Mamure, Lord Lindsay, none of them are known as bibliophiles, book collectors, book owners. And that tells us something really important. There's a lot we could learn from a full study of the paper. You know, that our knowledge of where paper is coming from and what, you know, what date it is and so on is really still incredibly limited. And there's so much more that could be learned about that. The binding is to have a binding that we can reliably assume is Scottish. If this manuscript is written in Scotland and it stays in Scotland until the end of the 16th century, at the very least, the binding is going to be Scottish too. And the stamps on it are quite unusual. And, you know, there's just so much that we could find out from this that I think it's a wonderful discovery, and we're at the beginning of something rather than presenting very, you know, full conclusions. Apart from Dauvit, who's had a long time to think about this.
Bit longer, but still plenty to do. Yeah, so just to, I mean, I've talked about its significance in, I mean, the other things like John Law, John Gibson, so these are big things. Well, the John Law is a small book, but it's the whole Spanish Chronicle one. So this is what is extraordinary about this. Isn't just that it's this sort of ephemeral booklet form, which there must be many of them, and they've all gone apart from this one, but it's actually representing a pretty old-fashioned version of this kind of material, and that's one way to put it. Obviously not old-fashioned because of the way it's been arranged, and the decisions about what to include are very contemporary, as we've heard. But the one thing that I will want to, I'm morphing the question now into what to do for the future, but one thing that awaits for me is to do a really close-up textual study of it and how it relates to similar things, because my impression is that although this and other king lists and compendia that can be discerned, I mean, for example, in Gray's Scanner Chronica, there's one of these booklet things, I'm sure, which has been copied in straight, because it's got that combination of king lists and origin legend and so on, is that although these things were very personal, and therefore, in a way, they could have written whatever they liked, my impression is they're incredibly conservative, and they generally, what they wanted to do was to just copy out what was there. But there's a bit more going on than just that. But anyway, just to understand this as a textual ecology, if you like, is you know, this has opened the door to being able to do that, and I look forward to really getting my hands into it.
Thank you, Dauvit. James, Ellie, and Elizabeth, are there any other next steps for the manuscript that you'd like to see? What's the future for it? It's not gonna sit in the collection store gathering dust, is it? Hopefully it can be used for broader research.
I mean, I think the fact that it's been digitised is really significant there.
That's hugely useful.
I would like to shout out to Eddie Martin, our very talented photographer. It takes a huge amount of skill to take photographs of something like this that are as good as this. And he's really done a splendid job. So for all your 3 a.m. research needs, then it's there now, wherever you are around the globe. I think things that Erica, our conservation manager, and I have talked about, you know, there are kinds of non-destructive analysis that can be done with things like the skin of the binding, the wood of the binding. We've talked, there's a big question, and you know, maybe this room is where we begin talking about this. There's a big question about whether it needs any kind of stabilization for the binding if researchers are going to be looking at it. And in the letters that when it was deposited at the National Library, the question was raised, and Martin Scoyen took the view that as this was an original binding of great significance, it shouldn't be touched in any way. There is a bigger question around, you know, how we balance, do we do anything to it to enable researchers to be able to look at the real thing, or do we say we've got very good digitizations? And for those research questions which need to see the real thing, then you know, but that then prevents more conservation. There are so many views on this, and it's a conversation.
So I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, I think digitization is wonderful, and it's absolutely true that, you know, when at 5 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning you want to you ask yourself a question about it, you can go and look at it. But anybody who works on manuscripts also knows that you have to also have that contact with the real thing. There's a point at which you need to sort of look and feel and be with a manuscript, and everybody who's worked on a manuscript will know that. Digitalization is great, but it's not the same. You look at it differently, you experience it differently, you think about the reading experience differently when you handle a manuscript, because you're trying to get back to how it was handled at the time, both in terms of how it was put together, but how people just experienced it. And sometimes actually, you know, just the way when you open a book, the way and where it falls open tells you something. And I think it's incredibly important that young scholars have that experience, because it also teaches you to look, you know, we were talking beforehand, you know, we're so old that when we first started working on manuscripts, you couldn't photograph them. You know, when you saw them in far-flung libraries, you were probably not going to see them again for a couple of years. So you didn't have to look at them hard. And I have actually quite a poor visual memory. But I had to kind of really learn how to look. And that's the thing that I think is incredibly important for young scholars, is to be able to learn how to look, so that when you see another manuscript that might be in the same hand, you actually recognize it because you've thought about how those letters were formed and the manuscript was put together. That goes on being very important. And you can get that to some extent through digitization, but you get it through that close contact with the actual material object.
I do completely agree.
I do.
Definitely. Yes.
Thank you very much. Let's end our prepared questions. So we'll do some Q&A in the audience now, but first of all, let's just raise our hands and thank you. And I'm right in thinking that the Chronicles can be viewed on the collections website now, can't they? They're online.
Absolutely.
So if anyone wants to go and have a look, they can do it. Hopefully this working mic is working. Yeah. Any questions before I complete the documents?
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. I'd like to ask a little bit about the treatment of English history as compared to Scottish history in the early portion of the manuscript. Later in the 16th century, some of the pro-union arguments really emphasised the fracturing of the English royal line to argue that union should happen on the basis of the Stuarts having a better claim to the English throne from St Margaret. And I saw this as something that happened in the 40s and onwards with the debates around Mary. Do you see a similar treatment in this manuscript a little earlier?
So this is about, I mean, Margaret is absolutely.
Yeah, no, but not just the criticality of Margaret, but an emphasis that then the English were conquered. So any rights that had been accrued prior to the Norman conquest are lost. Oh, look, the English royal line breaks again. Any inherited rights break again. oh, look, the English royal line breaks again with Henry VII. Any inherited rights are broken. Oh, look, up here, king, 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 straight line of inheritance. And so I was wondering whether you saw any similar contrast in how the two royal lines were treated.
Well, I mean, so I just return to the point I made about the nature. I'm just talking about the booklet, the nature of the exercise, which is virtually no narrative. So it's the only way to sort of access is this implicitly. So they're not going to tell us, by the way, have a look at this, but they are saying have a look at this by copying it all out, and at least it's for their own consumption. So being able to, but then, well, in the booklet itself, it's the most recent. I mean, it doesn't go further than the 1370s, so there isn't a sort of drawing attention to the fact that here we are, we've got James V, and he's. That's all. I think there's a lot that's implied, so you can read that in, but it's not made explicit.
So I mean, what I would say in relation to that is obviously it's slightly different with Mayor because it's the one text going through, and that text itself has a particular line which is essentially arguing. And remember, it was a text that was dedicated to James V, who's the son of obviously James IV and a Tudor. So it's sort of talking about the value of dynastic union. For me, the question that I confess I haven't yet got to the bottom of is that you've got that argument going through. What I'm not totally sure about yet is, what do all the cuts and changes add up to? Do they reshape that particular narrative in a way that changes it in some manner? And I haven't done enough work on it to know the answer to that. I mean, in many ways, of course, the history of the 15th and 16th century Scotland kingly line is challenging in its own right, because you've got continuity, but they all keep getting themselves blown up or killed on the field of battle, and you've got minority after minority. And of course, during the 1520s, the same thing was happening. So there's almost a kind of anti-narrative to the narrative that's going on at the same time. So I don't think neither of us are giving a totally straightforward answer to your question, but there's something going on, but we're not quite sure what it is.
No, I definitely agree with that. I mean, one of the things that struck me, just kind of tangential note, is there's an error the scribe has made an error in writing out the name of Harold when he's talking about the Norman conquest. He writes it with a K instead of an H. Consistently, or at least in multiple places. I haven't checked every instance of it, and that just really kind of stuck with me, because it feels like a name that you would know, but there's a mistake there, and there could be all kinds of interesting reasons for it. But that's something that I'm kind of puzzling over as to why that mistake is there.
Actually, I've just remembered I think I'm right that when it comes to the sort of king list part of it, other versions of the king list will give you a sort of sum total, which gets to nearly 2,000 years, and that's been omitted, I think. It's easy enough to check. And as a wee aside, 2,000 years seems to stick somehow, because, I mean, it's there in protoform, and it's still there, I think, when we're into nearly 1700 and so on. That's the language of how long have we been around? 2,000 years. It could have stayed. But anyway, that's not the kind of continuity you're referring to. But it's interesting, isn't it? So basically, we're searching around for the omissions as a way of understanding what's really going on. Here.
Yes.
Thank you. Good luck.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. This is not really my period at all, as you know, but you mentioned at one point, Sally, that 1526 is a very interesting time. Isn't it about the time when people realised Catherine of Aragon was not going to produce an heir, but before they decided to try and annul the marriage? So wouldn't that naturally have made James V the heir? Could something like that be a very specific context for the...
I mean, yeah, I mean, why not? I guess it depends. I'd like to think that Robert Robertoon is sitting there, and that's exactly what has occurred to him. And he's thought, right, where's my scribe? I'll get this manuscript put together for that purpose. And but joking aside, I mean, ideologically, yeah, that's a really interesting point. All the more reason, actually, for a particular take on Mayor to be generated at that point. Why not? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
No.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Mayor himself seems to be anticipating at least the possibility
Yes.
of the dynastic union.
Yeah.
So-
Absolutely.
More immediate.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. The age of. Yeah.
Thank you, all of you, for a really fascinating conversation. I think one thing that you've really adequately brought out is the slow, patient nature of the research with these kind of objects, and more generally that also says a lot about arts and humanities research, that it takes a long time. So it's almost unfair to pitch questions at you, because none of you actually have had enough time to absorb everything just about this one manuscript. But having said that, and to take things in a slightly different direction, I am very interested in the sort of physicality of it. And when Dauvit was speaking, first of all, about the very different nature textually of the first section, it's also different physically. And we would often not actually see that subsequently, because those intrusive edges would have been later trimmed off. The fact that it's not been rebound has saved it from that. The binding is really interesting, and I would really like to go back to Elizabeth just to ask you, I know you haven't had enough time to think about this, but it's so rare to have a Scottish binding that we can know is Scottish, and there's hardly any narrative about Scottish bindings, because Oldham's English bindings is your go-to thing, and they're English. So I just wanted to ask you for your first impressions about the binding, and if you could show us the slides again, and maybe with the lights down.
Slides, and then
Oh yeah.
So that we could
dim
see
the
a little
lights.
bit of the detail. That would be great.
yeah, so you're absolutely right that we don't know enough about Scottish bookbindings, and I think in a way it's kind of a really interesting area of research to go into more detail, because Mitchell's History of Scottish Bookbinding spends a lot of time arguing that bindings aren't Scottish, and actually, you know, I think we can revisit that and look at other things. You can see three lovely black squares at the moment, but if we turn the lights off, you should be able to see. There we go. So it's a blind stamped binding. So the tools, there's no gold, it's just the tools impressed on the leather. You can see the front board there in the full size image. It's decorated leather over wooden boards, and it's had a single clasp. What I've done on the other side of the screen there is to pull out the two binding stamps that are used. So the one at the top is an oblong stamp, which is used only on the front board in the sections near the spine. You can maybe just make out that there are these oblong imprints near the spine. It's clearly two animals chasing each other. Theories have included, John Morris looked at this manuscript in 1990 when it was at the National Library of Scotland, and posited maybe, you know, a hound chasing a hare. Certainly there are similar stamps, not the same stamp, but similar motifs in European bookbinding where it's one dog chasing another, a dog chasing a deer, but two animals chasing each other, at least as a starting point. And then the other stamp, now this, I've spent far too long staring at this. It's used in a lozenge, but it's a square that's been tilted at an angle. And I don't know how well you can make anything out in this, but it is an animal. It's bending round, so its back is arched, and it seems that its head is turned as if perhaps, Morris said, biting its own tail, perhaps biting leg, there are earlier manuscript illuminations of the story of the wolf biting its noisy foot, and maybe there's something like that going on. And there is at least one heraldic sketch of a tiger, which bears a certain resemblance to this, and none at all to a tiger. So whether this is a boar or a wolf or a tiger, or someone has at one point, and I'm failing now to remember exactly who this suggested it was a grazing animal. I think that was in one of the catalogue descriptions. But these stamps, so far, I've not managed to trace either of these on anything else, but they are similar stylistically to other stamps which are around. Yes.
Fragments that are in the binding.
So can we get the next slide, please? Thank you. And this is the inside of the backboard. So you can see the paste down, the piece of paper which has been stuck to that has lifted at the back. It's still adhered at the front. But this is at the back. You can see the wooden board and the leather turn-ins. You can see the thongs, the sewing supports, there are 3. And you can see that there's a medieval manuscript fragment which has been cut up and reused to strengthen around the backs of the binding. And this is probably 13th century, possibly early 14th. The text is a piece of the Decretals of Gregory IX, written in a collection of a kind of summary of canon law made in the mid-13th century and copied in inordinate quantities. And John Higgett's Scottish Libraries documents copies of the Decretals, at the big Scottish ecclesiastical institutions, multiple copies of them. However, it is printed and it does go through certain changes. It's printed quite early on, and it does seem that particularly at universities at Oxford and elsewhere, then the manuscripts of the earlier versions of the Decretals are cut up for use in bookbinding because they've been superseded by kind of the up-to-date edition of the text. So at the moment, I can't tell you any more about this, as in, have we got any other books that have got fragments of the same manuscript in? I mean, that would be the holy grail, but the chances of it are tiny. But certainly, at least it's a canon law manuscript, which points to somewhere close to an ecclesiastical institution or a university, or both. Maybe it's a St Andrews binding. We know there is bookbinding going on at St Andrews. We know that the names of the individuals who own the manuscript certainly could plausibly have connections to St Salvator's. So yeah, it's a possibility. That's all I'm saying. I'm going no further than that. And now you can turn the lights back on.
Nobody? Oh, yes, I'd like to bring the microphone up to you just so that the audience can hear.
That's Martin Scoyne's book label. Martin Scoyne's book label. Yes, that was put on it after he acquired it at the auction in 1990. And there's one at the front as well.
Yes.
So you talked earlier about the lack of use of history in the original 2014 referendum in Scotland. If there wasn't another referendum, given that there is still a large amount of Scottish independent sentiment throughout the nation, how would you say the Chronicle would play a role in both the Scottish independence as well as the unification of Britain?
So, well, that's a great question. I'll have a go at that. I mean, obviously, we would tout its value in actually showing that these are questions that have exercised people far, over a lengthy period of time. But I also think what the Chronicle does, in a way, is it, by virtue of the fact that it's juxtaposing a range of material, it kind of lays it out for you, if you like, and we're seeing one potential ideological reading emerging, but it's not the only one necessarily. And that surely is actually quite useful within this context. There's a history to how people think about independence and unionism, which is longer than the history of the SNP. This shows you it goes way back. And the better we understand that, perhaps the more informed our own choices can be. I'll say something else here, which I'll say partly because I was talking to James Macmillan, who is associated with this university, about this recently. I mean, I think there's a further there are two further problematic elements to this. I think sometimes there's a discomfort in talking about Scottish nationalism pre 1707 or 1603 because it involves thinking about monarchy. And I think there's also a real problem on occasion thinking about Scottish nationalism pre-1560 because it involves thinking about Catholicism. And I don't actually think that that either of those things have necessarily been kind of wholly absorbed and argued through. So they factor in to how we understand these issues historically. But my earlier point on that, I think, is for me the crucial one, which is that we should understand them historically. It helps us to work out what we think now.
Thank you so much for amazing manuscripts and talk about this. And I'm really looking forward to see it in the museum. And I'm quite interested about the Latin using in the manuscripts because this is about like nationalities, about Scottish, it's written in the Scotland. And I'm thinking the Latin used in these manuscripts is affected by the Scottish, like the dialects Scottish, or it's just normal Latin?
It's actually a very, I mean, there's a simple answer, which is, of course, Latin was the universal language of Latin Christendom.
Yes.
But if anybody had read it out, you'd probably know where they came from.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so that's something so that's an interesting question. Yes. So it's like, in so many ways, the beauty of this is that, as Sally was saying, it stimulates discussion and things that look very straightforward. You then look a little bit more detail. You think, other perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question in relation to Mayor. I mean, Latinists are often quite critical of Mayor's Latin, that it's convoluted. I mean, that the text was not translated until Constable translated it in the 19th century, unlike Boyce's Chronicle, which was almost immediately translated because he had a rather more sort of Ciceronian and approachable style. I mean, still, I would say quite hard to translate, but it was more amenable to that. I mean, I think Dauvit's point's exactly right. But on the other hand, Mayor got his Chronicle printed in Paris, and it was certainly disseminated out with Scotland because it was in the, if you like, the lingua franca.
Just wondering, how much do we know about Roberton? Was he enough of a personage, as it were, that he could have had his ideas, gathered his stuff together, and then either written them out himself or paid somebody else to do it?
Yeah, that's such a crucial question, which we've dodged all the way through.
Ross, we've got the Roberton inscriptions, if we could pull those up. So the first thing to say is the only thing we have in this manuscript is a very simple inscription, the book of Sir Robert Roberton, Chaplain of Edinburgh. And that's what we have. And somewhere to get that round about there, is that it?
Yeah.
Not that one, the next one. That's it. Oh, no, it's not.
Get it there.
Sorry. Oh, you can get it there. So the first thing to say is there is a Robert Roberton who appears in the St Salvator's records of students, and he's described there as a pauper. So he's not coming from a rich family. He becomes a chaplain, so he's ordained. There's a couple of charter references which may be to the same Roberton because they describe him as Sir Robert Roberton. One of them is a grant of land, or a grant of the money for tenements, which is 1532, and then there's one in 1546, which is interesting because he's appointed to the vicarage of Tarvit near Cooper. Because John Gray, who was one of the assassinators of Cardinal Beaton, has been removed from that post, and Roberton is appointed. However, there is another charter which appoints a Nigel Lang, I think it is, to the same charge. And it also says, it's a little bit later, but it says because the post has been demitted by the evil of John Gray. So whether Robertson never took up that post, or whether Robertson is already in Edinburgh and has been, you know, kind of holding it in plurality, but then they actually get somebody else in and they don't even mention Robertson in that chart. I really haven't got to the bottom of quite what's going on there. My sense is that if he's described as a pauper when he's at university and he's a chaplain, and we don't find any evidence that he progresses beyond a chaplain, that he's not someone who is commissioning manuscripts. He's somebody who's writing his own, or you know, is acquiring things.
Yes.
I don't think he's a patron in any.
But one could assume, could you not, that the person who put that first section together is also the person who then instructed somebody to continue on the same folio, and whether that was Robertson or somebody else.
Don't know.
Somebody's put something together and they thought, oh, we've got to do something more with this, and we'll leave these bits out of Microphone. It feels like a continuum.
And that absolutely. I mean, that's the key question, to which as yet we don't have the answer. I will say, I'll just add something else that we haven't commented yet, that the mayor has been very closely proofread.
Yes.
So it's and you can tell that it's been proofread actually against the printed edition, which is really interesting because there are careful corrections. Have we got examples?
If I can get us to find them, just bear with us, folks. Not too near the start.
And I mean, there are also in the later books of the sort of classic examples also that the scribe just gets fed up copying long lists of names and actually says, and then there were 20 other people. But somebody else, a later reader, deliberately writes them all in at length.
Yeah, that's one. So you can see the margins crammed with names, and then the highlighted text there is.
Yeah, and that's all out of the printed copy. Yeah. So there are quite a lot of very small, like sort of one word corrections, words omitted generally, but then you get, particularly later on, you get these lengthier, careful editions adding in from the printed text.
Not that one. Nope, sorry.
Other way.
The other way. Okay.
Yeah.
And we've got time for one more question if there's any in the room. No? Okay, fantastic. That's just in time, plenty of time to get 5 minutes to walk down to the Wardlaw Museum to enjoy your refreshment and to go and have a look at the Chronicles in person and the From These Parts exhibition. Thank you all for coming today, both in person and online. One final round of applause for our panelists. So if you know how to get to the Wardlaw Museum, so out of the quad, turn right down Butts Wynd. When you get to the end, you'll see it across the road. But we'll be heading there shortly as well.
Thank you, Ross. Thanks for hosting. Yes.